I'm Alan Wardis, and this is Think Radio Presents Think People. My guest today is documentary filmmaker Richard Ray Perez.
I think the progressive movement has become over-secularized. We've not come to understand and respect the power of faith and how we can embrace other people's faith and how that it can inform ethical and moral actions.
Welcome to another great conversation on Think Radio. If you like Think People, then I know you'll enjoy the other shows in the Think Radio Presents family of podcasts. Think Business, a weekly discussion with entrepreneurs, innovators, and disruptors on sustainable business into the 21st century. Think Planet, conversations with thought leaders on important environmental issues. Subscribe to Think Radio Presents on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever else you get great content. And don't forget to help us spread the word by liking our social media channels and sharing the content we post. We're grateful to have you in the conversation on Think Radio Presents. My guest today is documentary filmmaker Richard Ray Perez. Perez is a graduate of Harvard University with a degree in visual and environmental studies. He is currently director of creative partnerships with the documentary film program at the Sundance Institute. From 2010 to 2014, Perez produced and directed a documentary film called Cesar's Last Fast, subtitled Cesar Chavez, A Historic Fast and the Fight for Farm Workers' Rights. It's an intimate, often heartbreaking, look at 36 days in 1988 when Chavez vowed to consume nothing but water. It was partly in protest and partly as self-imposed penance for not doing enough to protect farm workers from toxic pesticides. Among other honors, the film was a Sundance official selection in 2014. Richard, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
You know, there have been a lot of films made over the years about the Chicano rights movements in the 20th century. In particularly the United Farm Workers, documenting their story and the rise of that union that Cesar Chavez founded and ran for so many years. What was it about this facet of the story that said to you it just hadn't been told yet?
Yeah. So there was a number of inspirations for the film, and one of them was that Cesar's spiritual commitment hadn't been fully examined and explored, his spiritual commitment to his work. And I felt that we had, in sort of progressive political circles, it's largely a secular movement now. And that it lost its connection to faith-based groups, it's lost a moral high ground to the religious right. And one of the reasons I made this film is nobody really looked at Cesar's connection to his faith, how that faith was linked to his actions and motivation fighting for farm workers' rights, and how faith can inspire social justice movements today in a way that it hadn't in recent decades. So that was one of the reasons I wanted to make the film. There was also a practical reason, and that is I had access to this incredible trove of unseen footage, mostly of the fast he undertook in 1988, and then footage that a filmmaker named Lorena Parlee had shot when Cesar died in 91. She was given access by the family to record the private burial preparations and rosary. And when I reviewed that footage, there was something very profound in that, and incredibly moving, and it moved me in ways that no other images and footage related to Cesar's work or the stories that had been told about his work ever resonated with me. It was deeply powerful.
Why do you think that is?
I think there's often a trend when telling stories around important social issues, and specifically with civil rights issues, there's a responsibility of conveying the information, the relevance, the facts, and that often gets in the way of prioritizing the emotional experience in a film and a story. And when I saw that footage, I thought, this is profoundly powerful, in a way that information, statistics, data, historical facts has never moved me. Like, this is so much more moving.
Well, it's a story.
And so that was one of the reasons. So I thought it was time to tell the story differently, to tell the story without a narrator, to tell a story that is based around the emotions and the devotion and the power of his acts, and not about the information and the historical record and the responsibility that people must know. I trusted inherently in the material and let it speak.
Well, there are two really interesting questions embedded there. The first, I want to go back to what you said about faith-based activism.
Yeah.
When we think back to Martin Luther King, for instance, people take it for granted. Faith was a big part of his motivation and a big part of that movement. Why is it that we sort of lost track of that with Chavez work?
That's a really good question, and all I could say is that it was probably an effort to make sure that we include the secular and people who aren't of faith in progressive movements. And sometimes, we think of faith as a very personal thing, and that it's, and especially, and that it's been, it's either very personal or it's been co-opted for the public square in the way that the religious right has. And so I think it's made progressive people uncomfortable.
So this was a way to make it more politically acceptable on a broad stage.
It was, and I'll tell you this: I myself am not a Christian. I was born and raised Catholic, but I don't identify as a Christian now as an adult. And it took me many years to come to fully understand and respect and honor Christianity. And so I was also at a point where I had been practicing Buddhism for a number of years, and I was experiencing a profound understanding of faith experientially. And so I was at a place where I was I would say more compassionate toward Christianity. And I saw the power of Christianity and faith in Cesar's actions. And so I wanted to try to connect audiences to that understanding and experience, to have a new, better, and perhaps compassionate and non-judgmental understanding for faiths that may not be our own.
Right. Well, and so the second question that prompted for me was, how did we get to the place where we try to take faith motivation, spiritual roots, away from social justice actions? I mean, one way to look at it is that those two things are always at least neighbors, if not motivated from the same place.
And I have to say that I consider myself a nonfiction storyteller and not a historian of social movements or an expert in building social movements or faith and how faith lives in society. But what I just know as being a sort of a what we might call today a woke citizen, that Christianity, I think, has, and maybe the right has there's something a little bit right about it that we maybe have come to look down on. And as the right, especially intellectuals, and and all I could say is that I think the progressive movement has become over secularized, and we've not come to understand and respect the power of faith and how we can embrace other people's faith and how that it can inform ethical and moral actions.
And that's a little bit ironic, really,
Yeah.
because one of the criticisms that's often leveled at progressives is that they are too embroiled in earth-based sort of spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's, on the one hand, progressives are criticized for this, but on the other, they're actively rejecting other kinds of faith perspectives. Well, you say you're moved by the personal aspect that you saw in this footage, the story that you wanted to tell from a different perspective. You come at that personally, though, right? I mean, you have a personal connection to this story in some ways.
Yeah, and it was, it's fascinating that there were the personal connection to the story, the life experience, and often what I would say were, we might even call them repressed memories that emerged. And so, first off, my dad was a migrant farm worker for 22 years.
Where?
In California.
Okay.
So he came to California in 1924 when he was 6 years old with his extended family. They migrated up and down California, migrating with the crops. Seasonally, they lived in what would become my hometown of San Fernando, California, which is about 20 miles north of downtown LA. It was then the center of the citrus packing industry in that area. So but he migrated with his family up until 1942. At the outbreak of World War II, he went back to Mexico, where he married my mom. My first eldest three siblings were born in Mexico, and in 52 they came back to the States. When he came back to the States, he came back to the town he lived in, where I grew up. He worked in packing houses, packing tomatoes, packing citrus, and eventually found a factory job. My aunts, who didn't go back to Mexico during the war, they lived all nearby. On 4 consecutive blocks, I had aunts and uncles, and when I was a kid, they often got together and over coffee, breakfast, and they talked about life as migrant farm workers. And I heard those stories, and they were moving and powerful and touching and also unimaginable.
Well, because these were really hard years.
These were, I mean, so they, my aunts talked about how my grandmother used to have to build huts next to the migrant camps out of mud and straw and sticks for them to live in for that crop. And she did this regularly. There was not housing always provided for migrant farm workers. Life outside of the camps was terrible. Most people don't know that there was a form of Jim Crow in California, where Mexicans were not could only watch movies from the balconies. Beaches were segregated. Swimming pools were segregated. Mexicans could only swim in the pools. Mexicans and Filipinos could only swim in the pools on Fridays just before they were going to chlorinate the pools. And so my aunts and my dad talked about this humiliation in very painful terms, but also at the same time resilient terms, because by then they were no longer immigrants, and we were living in a home that my dad was buying, and I would call it a lower middle class lifestyle. So, but it was just profound to hear those stories, and a story about how when my dad was an infant that my grandmother was sick and couldn't breastfeed him. And so my grandmother had my aunts, his older sisters, find a gloat, clean her teats, and have my dad suckle from her. Amazing stories that I realized later inspired or motivated me to tell stories that are anchored in this very authentic experience.
Yes, well, human experience.
In human experience.
Yeah. Well, even then, the struggle continued. It may not have been quite so bad, but still, the fight was harsh.
Oh, and so this was what was the story that I almost forgot, and at some point it was jarred loose after I'd started making the film. And so about 1969, 1970, I was in Head Start in my hometown of San Fernando, which was all Mexican-American, Chicano, first, second generation. And so I was in a Head Start classroom, and these activist Chicano students would come from what's now Cal State Northridge to volunteer in this, social experiment and progressive movement of educating poor kids in Head Start. So so one day I'm in Head Start, we get down, we get our free lunch because we're all poor kids, and this university student sits down and has lunch with us. And I notice when he starts eating his lunch, and part of that lunch is this bits of fruit in heavy syrup, fruit cocktail.
Uh-huh.
He starts to eat his fruit cocktail, and I notice he starts plucking the grapes out of his fruit cocktail. And I was very curious. And I said, "Ooh, how come you're plucking the grapes out of your fruit cocktail?" And he picks up a grape and he said, "Well, because the people who own the grape fields, they treat the people who pick the grapes terribly. They humiliate them. They pay them very little money. They make them live in shacks. And when the grape pickers complain, they fire them. For that reason, I can't eat these grapes."
Oh, wow.
And I remember looking down at my grapes, and they became very ugly.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't eat them either. So I started plucking the grapes out of my fruit cocktail.
Mm.
And my classmates, the fellow preschool students, they had all been listening. And they looked down at their grapes, and they couldn't eat them either. And they plucked their grapes out of their fruit cocktail. Throughout elementary school, we were all in the free lunch program, and we'd always get that fruit cocktail. We could never eat those grapes. And in that moment, when I was sitting in Head Start, what I didn't know at the time that my dad had been a migrant farm worker, often picking grapes for 22 years. What I didn't know is that I still had extended family and some aunts and uncles who were still working in the fields at that time, picking grapes, peaches, and fruits throughout California. About a year later, the UFW comes down to San Fernando and starts community organizing and gets local residents to go out and picket in front of the supermarket to get people not to buy grapes. And my dad loaded up my siblings and me into the station wagon, and we drove out to that supermarket and picketed with the UFW.
You were on the picket line.
I was on the picket line. My dad made us go out there because he knew what those farm workers lived through. My dad lived it, and he couldn't in good conscience not be a part of that picket.
So that brings us back to a point that you made, which is that facts tend to be less compelling than stories. I mean, here are these stories that you can tell about the grapes and your memory of standing on the picket line and the stories that you heard from family members. Those are the kinds of things that you attempted to communicate in your film.
Yeah, and it's and I don't want to say facts matter. Obviously, facts matter.
Well,
but
yes.
it's I think that certainly this is true for me, and I suspect it's true for perhaps most people, that our emotional memory is stronger than our response to information and facts, and that before we are rational beings, we are emotional beings. That it is, and that is a product of evolution and a product of the lizard brain and the I'm no neuroscience, but it's like we could understand a ferocious tiger standing and tells us to run, and that's going to stay with us in a deeper way than if somebody says you are X% likely to be attacked by a tiger.
Right. Statistics prove.
Yeah, exactly. And that also, I think, explains the trouble that we find ourselves in today in America, where I would describe, sadly, a big percent of our population, I describe it as immune to facts. Immune to facts around whether it's climate change or any number of things.
We've got our minds made up already.
Exactly. Or it's not so much we got our minds made up already, but that we're not responding to facts, we're responding to emotion. We're responding to fear of the other, crossing the border. We're responding to fear of our demographic, our tribe, if you will, declining in power and influence, and that any information about income inequality, undocumented immigration, that's not going to penetrate our feelings. And I hate to get sort of like so plainly political about it, but that's what Trump exploits. And that's not the fault of the public or the viewer. I think that just is the way we are wired.
Well, you've said we're wired to respond to emotion first.
Yeah, before we know it.
And, would you agree with the statement that we're wired from a very early age to respond to story? Mm-hmm. That story is how we communicate information as children.
Yeah. And not only as early, right? So that's why we have, children's stories and, why we teach fables and why kids want stories read to them, at bedtime. But I think also as civilizations, that in earlier human civilizations, we imparted knowledge, shared wisdom, and conveyed information about what it is to be human through story. And certainly in before there was the written word, that's how we, communicated. And when I think about the stories that my aunts told around our kitchen table, whether they knew it or not, and some stories I think they did know, they were telling to impart knowledge onto either my sisters and me, convey information.
But also values,
share an experience that they may not have fully understood yet, because at the end of some stories, you're still wondering, what does that mean? And
we don't really know yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's no secret, and it's even become a cliche about the power of story. What's the problem is that I think the progressives have not fully realized how to use story, authentic story. Now there's so much media out there. People know when they're being manipulated and sold,
Sure.
But how can you tap into authenticity?
Well, you have to genuinely want to get at the truth.
Yeah.
In order to find the authenticity to begin with, and then tell it.
Yeah, and sometimes that's an exploration of what that truth is, right?
Yeah.
Because, I described that, different storytellers that I work with, and as I evolve as a storyteller, there's some filmmakers who are curious about the world and want to explore and try to discover the truth. There are some filmmakers who are convinced they know it, and their job is to try to convince you and tell you what that is.
Well, and when you pick up a camera and you head out into the world with a preconceived idea, you're going to be able to find the images and the interviews to support that point of view.
Yeah. And so part of the curiosity, there's some authenticity inherent in curiosity. If you're genuinely curious about the world and why do we hate, why do we discriminate, why do we fear, instead of just saying, pontificating, it's racism, it's they're immune to facts, etc. There's a chance for a more profound discovery than an opportunity for statements.
So storytelling and communication are not the same thing.
Oh, not at all. Yeah. You can communicate anything. And storytelling ultimately, we hope, is transformative. It is, as I said, a way to strive to gain some understanding of who and where we are, why we are. It is to try to arrive at a place of greater wisdom. All of those things. That's the power of storytelling, not its capacity to manipulate.
Which brings us to my next question, which deals with your position as a filmmaker, but in particular, building creative partnerships at Sundance Institute. And using documentary filmmaking as a storytelling platform.
Yeah.
Why do documentary films matter to us? Why are we still telling stories in this format?
I think there are a number of reasons, and some are more practical. And I'll start with the very practical, and that is making a documentary film. And documentary is much more accessible, and there's a lower barrier to entry than trying to write a script and raise money, for God knows how long to shoot that script. I often describe that as, there are sadly too many people in LA and New York shopping around a stack of paper for 10, 20 years trying to get funding to do that.
I know some of them.
Exactly, and very talented people. With documentaries, sometimes you need a camera and an eye and access or a vision.
And time.
And then a desktop editing system. So I think that's one reason, and certainly there are more documentary films being made today than there ever were. The other is that we now recognize exactly what I described earlier, that transformative capability of nonfiction storytelling. And because the story is rooted in some interpretation of reality that we could all grasp, there's a profundity in that. And that's, I think, what resonates with audiences who see true, authentic storytelling. And
so is there a danger there, though, that because the words you just used were some interpretation of reality, the documentary filmmaker is not a cartographer?
Yeah.
They're telling the story as they see it.
Yeah.
Is there a danger that these films sometimes are taken as fact when they're really peppered largely with interpretation? So
the answer is yes, and I think we have to understand the full range of documentary, right? There are some documentaries and a documentary tradition of journalism and news documentary.
Right.
But that's one kind of documentary. We used to think that documentary film is conveying a story that all happens out there, out externally, outside of us. But I think we realize, too, that there's an internal narrative and an internal interpretation of the world that is essentially, from our perspectives, nonfiction. It's our real experience, and that is also storytelling, right? And it's a subjective form of storytelling. I would call it nonfiction storytelling. That's valid documentary.
Well, because even the novelist says, here's the world as I see it.
Yeah.
You can't escape that.
Yeah.
There seems to be a line, though, that is being crossed more frequently now than I've experienced before, and that is toward dramatization. I just saw a film called American Animals, for instance. So, the story of 4 college kids who decided to, pull off an art heist.
Art heist, yeah.
And the film was very, very powerful and compelling,
but
it was largely dramatized.
Yeah.
It's sprinkled in with actual interviews with real players.
And part of that is functional. So when we are talking about a past tense story for which no visual material exists, how do you bring it to life? And if you limit documentary storytelling only to stories only where visual material exists, then that eliminates a lot of potential stories.
It does.
And that's particularly true of past tense stories. And so how do we reconstruct events for which there were no cameras or photographs? And that's become one of the solutions. And obviously some films do it better than others. Recreations have been popular in really bad TV shows and the 48 Hours, et cetera, et cetera. Certainly filmmakers have become more sophisticated about it. There's a great film called The Imposter that does it well. Some filmmakers have turned to animation. Waltz with Bashir is a good example.
Well, that's one way to separate what's real from what's fabricated.
And the key is it's like that filmmaking's a visual medium, and so how do you create that? How do you use that property of film?
I just wonder because the narrative filmmaker understands all the tricks.
Yeah.
Camera, lighting, sound, to manipulate emotion. Does the documentary filmmaker have a particular responsibility to be careful?
Well, yes, and if scripted filmmakers are free from any sort of responsibility or ethics. Nobody said. Very rarely do scripted filmmakers get fact checked.
Right.
But yes, I think there's a different ethical standard and moral standard for nonfiction filmmakers, but that doesn't mean that they're subject to a journalistic standard unless they are presenting themselves as journalists. So certainly if somebody is trying to pass themselves and their work off as a work of journalism, that's a problem. And I always say to my filmmaking colleagues that we know how the sausage is made. We know how to manipulate people. We know how the sleight of hand. And there are some times, though, that you have to alert the audience and say, this is a creative interpretation.
Well, let's go back to your film for just a second.
Sure.
I'm curious to know, once you were in the process of gathering stories and looking at this found footage, was there anything about the story that surprised you?
Yeah, and the answer is yes. And there were many things that surprised me. And often there's a good thing about independent documentary and a bad thing about it, and that is how long it takes. And the bad thing is that it just takes too long. It took me 7 years to make this film.
Yeah.
The good thing is that during that time, you have the opportunity to assess what you're trying to say, how you're trying to say it. And so the story I initially set out to tell evolved in a better way. And what I mean by that is at the start of making this film, I didn't fully appreciate Cesar Chavez's complexities. I didn't fully appreciate how he was a human being and subject to human flaws, and how that caused tension within the Union, particularly after 1975. And it is very easy, both for storytellers and audiences, to rally around a very simple narrative of a hero and embrace hagiography. And I discovered that my film couldn't do that. I had to explore, part of his human self.
Did that give you pause? Did that cause people who are supporting you and telling you stories to not like what you were doing?
So in the filmmaking and creative world, that was a very positive thing. Because, a lot of the funders were like, oh, my God, it's just going to be 90 minutes of hero worship. And so they embraced the fact of this complexity. And now, certainly me as a more experienced filmmaker, I embrace complex films far more than these simplified narratives. But the people I'd been working with close to, members of the Cesar Chavez family, the Cesar Chavez Foundation, and Dolores were very uncomfortable with an exploration of Cesar's flaws.
What about you personally? Because your backstory there is a small child being on a picket line. Yeah. It would have been very easy for you to grow up with a kind of hero worship.
Yeah, and that was part of both the growth and the appreciation of how long it took. Because then I had to figure out, clearly I have to embrace, those negative aspects of Cesar. How do I do that? So at first it's like, yes, it's a little, sort of myth-shattering, but then also it's affirming because and what it taught me is that we can't expect our heroes and leaders to be perfect. That is unrealistic, and that, I mean, it's pointless.
Well, and it also means that I know that I'm not perfect, but
Yeah.
it won't stop me from maybe contemplating doing something heroic.
Precisely, and it's part of this like oversimplified narratives that don't do us any good, because they present a false understanding of the world and the complicated forces behind it, and it keeps us from deepening and gaining a better understanding around a civil rights leader, a poor people's movement. What's to be learned if all it's like, oh, you're a saint and that's it.
Mm-hmm. Was there anything at all about the link between spirituality and activism that you set out to explore that surprised you?
Well, I can say that there was, and this is a sort of a smaller example, and I shouldn't be surprised. So when Cesar started organizing in Delano, in the early 60s, most of the farm workers were Mexican immigrants and Filipino immigrants, and so they were Catholic. Interestingly, there were pockets of Yemeni migrant farm workers who were Muslim. And he tried to embrace the Catholicism, but there were some priests who wanted nothing to do with him because some of the growers were Catholics. They were
and donors.
Yeah, and they sided with the growers, so I wasn't, necessarily shouldn't have been surprised, but ultimately, there was a movement of progressive Catholic priests and nuns who were pivotal to the movement, and that fully embraced the movement, and of course, there were a lot of important Jews who were social activists who worked in the union and played key roles and fought for discrimination for people who were not of their background, did not share their faith. As I said, there was an important Yemeni contingent, and the first person killed in the farm worker struggle was a Muslim man. So
that's not a story we know about.
Yeah, and it's in the film. And so whatever language Cesar was able to speak, that it spoke to Muslim farm workers that we didn't know exist, that's like, wow, I wish I was there to see how he reached out to them and how he managed to say that, we're in the same struggle.
Mm-hmm. Well, bridge building like that is something we could use a lot more of now.
Certainly, it's like, again, about where we are today. It's like, as far as I know, I don't know how many interfaith dialogues are going on, especially with, we tend to paint today's evangelical movement in a broad stroke, but are progressives reaching out and exploring this sort of intersectionality of values around, and it's happening a little bit within the evangelical movement. They're starting to, realize that, faith and politics, they're not just about pro-life and abortion rights issues. When they think about immigrants' rights, they're starting to recognize that it's a moral issue.
Well, I suspect the answer to your question is on whether people are reaching out.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on the scale.
Yeah.
I'd love to know your thoughts on that. That at the national level, maybe not.
Yeah.
But on the neighborhood level, where people are living side by side,
Yeah.
I suspect there's a fair amount of it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, we have neighbors, et cetera. But, one of the things I wish I had the resources to do was, screen the film in megachurches and see how they respond to a man of faith and deep faith. and see if there's anything in Cesar's story that resonates with an audience like that, an audience of spiritual beings.
I hope you get that opportunity.
Yeah.
Richard, are you working on anything now?
I like to say I'm working on making a living.
Well, that's the other aspect of documentary filmmaking.
You know, I have a wonderful position at Sundance Institute, and I oversee a wonderful program. And so in that capacity, I get to bring together filmmakers who want to work with social change makers. And we brainstorm film ideas. I oversee a granting pool that helps them fund the ideas, and we provide consultancies and grants for the change makers to use those films to make social change. Mm-hmm. We're increasing the participation of filmmakers from the global south because that's where a lot of the change makers that we work with are doing their work. So it keeps me really busy. It's incredibly fulfilling, and
Well, what an opportunity as a filmmaker to have your fingers in so many projects and guiding so many creatives. Well, Richard, I've enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for stopping by today.
Sure, thank you.
Thanks for watching. Join us next week for another great conversation on Think Radio Presents Think People.